Hello, welcome to the University of Birmingham Open Day, and welcome to the Lapworth Museum of Geology and the Department of Earth Sciences. We're today having various activities and engagement and practical taster sessions for students interested in the geology programs here at the University of Birmingham. My name is Dr. Tom Dunkley-Jones. I'm a paleontologist and palaeobiologist interested in how climate and life has evolved and changed over hundreds of thousands of years to millions of years, and really how the Earth system responds to those major evolutionary innovations in life and the ecosystems. I'm particularly interested in the oceans, and I'm standing here today beside a lovely display in the Lapworth Museum of local geology, the very famous Wenlock limestone. Now, the Wenlock limestone is a reef system from the Silurian interval, about 400 million years old. What I've presented today is really an overview of how marine systems like this and their evolution have impacted the way that the climate system responds to major changes in the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, obviously today we're really interested in the effects of CO2 emissions into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels and industrial activity and transport activity. There's a lot of concern about the effect that CO2 will have on the climate system. So we put CO2 in the atmosphere, we warm the planet, and the climate responds. But there's also another aspect to CO2 going into the atmosphere, and that's the way that this CO2 reacts in seawater. As CO2 diffuses and is absorbed by seawater, it changes the pH. The seawater will become more acidic. And there are great concerns that that change in pH, that increase in acidity, will affect the ability of many marine organisms to produce hard parts, the shells that we see in some of this fossil material, but you'd also see on the beaches today or in coral reefs. So these organisms' ability to calcify and produce these shells is potentially affected by the CO2 that we're putting into the atmosphere now, and that will go into the ocean and the surface of the ocean. What today's demonstration and practical looked at is ways that we can kind of model this just by using very simple test tubes of water and blowing CO2 into that water. What we did is took some just pure water with some indicator solution and blew CO2 into that test tube. And you can see the effects of CO2 as that water becomes more acidic. And what's interesting about systems like this in the Paleozoic, so going back to some of the earliest life, is that all of our sort of shell-building organisms tended to live very close to the continent, so on these shallow water systems. If you went out into the deep ocean in Silurian times or in Permian times, there would be no deep ocean carbonate rocks being formed, because there were no organisms living in the surface ocean that produced carbonate shells. So in these times, the oceans were being dominated by just red clay, no limestones, no carbonate rocks. And what happens when we put CO2 into a system like that is that there's no buffer. So as the CO2 goes into the oceans, it can dissolve carbonate rocks, but if they aren't there in the deep ocean, then the oceans are much more sensitive to that CO2 and climate change. However, there's a major change in life and in the Earth system during the late Triassic, early Jurassic time. And that is really driven by the evolution of life. And what I've got here is some... Oh, I've dropped it. Got here is some, what you might think of just bits of kind of white powder. It looks a bit like talcum powder. This is actually sediment from the deep ocean. So it's from about 3 kilometers water depth in the deep ocean, in the modern oceans. And what this sediment is made up of is the remains of thousands, millions of tiny, tiny organisms that once floated in the surface ocean, have died. They produce calcium carbonate shells, they die, and then these sink down to the bottom of the oceans. So in the modern oceans, we have oceans covered in this kind of white, powdery, calcium carbonate rich material. Now, these organisms that produce this, say, evolved in the late Triassic and started really producing a lot of this carbonate material through the Jurassic into the Cretaceous. Many people in the UK will know this material. People in the south coast will probably have houses built on it. They'll go for walks and enjoy the scenery. And it's the chalk. So the chalk of southern England and up to Yorkshire is the remains of these tiny, tiny single-celled organisms that produce this vast amount of limestone, calcium carbonate, that forms the chalk. So the key question is, what happens if you put CO2 into the atmosphere and into the oceans when you have a sea floor that's covered in this material? And what happens is that over tens of thousands of year timescales, this chalk will dissolve and effectively keep the chemistry of the ocean relatively stable, the pH relatively stable over those timescales. So it's in a way like an active buffering system of the oceans. So this is the major change between times like the Wenlock, the Silurian times, to the modern day system. However, we ended on a cautionary note, because just because we have this buffering system in the modern ocean doesn't mean that the effects of ocean acidification will go away. This buffering will only happen if the CO2 can mix down into the deep ocean with ocean currents. And that mixing time takes 1,000 years or even longer. So the rate at which we're putting CO2 into the oceans now is over years to decades. And because it's so quick, that CO2 is concentrated in the surface ocean and doesn't mix down into the deep ocean. So this buffering effect can't take place. So there's still a really strong concern about changes in the surface ocean acidity and pH over short timescales, so over the coming hundreds of years. And the effect that this might have on organisms such as corals or pteropods, these small planktonic organisms that live in the Southern Ocean. So the strong concern over the effects on life of our current activities. So we had a great group of people interacting and doing these experiments, actually doing these real-time acidification experiments, and also looking at the effects. So they blew into these tubes and saw the pH changes. But then we added some carbonate material and did the same experiment and saw that the changes in acidity were much, much less because of this buffering effect. So it's a really good way of teaching students and getting them engaged with the basic chemistry of the oceans. So thanks very much for listening. We hope that you can come and join us on another open day in the future and come and talk about some of these problems and this interrelationship between life, climate, and the chemistry of the oceans. Thanks very much.